This is one of what Barney and I do on a termly basis, Keble Debate, and obviously this term is the novel, next term is drama, the summer is poetry. And we're just very, very excited to have Nicholas with us this evening. And I think of Nicholas, I met him in sort of true British style on a riverbank, and we've become very good friends over a number of years. And there are just some extraordinary sort of touching points. But I think his career is an extraordinary one, and I hope he's going to share a lot of that with us. He came to the Dragon School, so Oxford was very much part of the network. He lived abroad for a very long time, educated at the Dragon, and then at Winchester, and then at Cambridge. And he worked for the BBC, and then the Times, and then he was the youngest ever literary editor of the Daily Telegraph. But then his moment came, and I hope he's going to share it with us, the decision to become a novelist, from being the youngest ever literary editor of the Telegraph to determination to become a novelist. And he went to South America, and he's going to share his thoughts on South America with us, and met all the extraordinary novelists, and wrote some fantastic books, several of which I have here, in Latin America. And then he met Bruce Chatwin in Patagonia, literally. And then more work unfolded. He published a biography of Chatwin, and then he moved to Tasmania for 7 years, and wrote from there. And then he came back again. His most recent novel is The Sandpit, which is a return to Oxford, and there's some fascinating connections to be made there. And he also spent a year at All Souls writing what I think is absolutely the best history book about the confrontation between Churchill and Halifax. It's an extraordinary work. If you haven't read it, you must, because nowhere else has it satisfactorily explained how the establishment character Halifax didn't get the job and Churchill did. And I think it was a seminal moment. And I think if it had gone the other way, I wouldn't be here. Most of my family died in the Holocaust, but I wouldn't be here. But we'd all be talking German. So I think it's an incredibly important book. So I'm going to hand over to Nicholas and to take us round how he became a writer, and also I'm very keen that he shares with us his thoughts on Chatwin, a most extraordinary writer, and also the sort of coming back to Oxford, and he's now writing the first authorised biography of Ian Fleming, but that's for the end. So I'm going to hand over to Nicholas to take us on the journey.
Well, it's very nice to be here in Oxford, and especially in Keble. It's the first time I've come into the college, having always been told how ugly it was. And my breath was just taken away when I stepped into the courtyard, and I feel incredibly ashamed I believed what John Betjeman led us to believe. Oxford is very, very important in my life. To me, it represents England, what I knew of it. I'd come here, I was deposited aged about 9, having lived in the Far East and Paris. My father was a diplomat. And so I grew up in kind of hot countries speaking different languages. And England was just a word to me until I returned here on a boat, because in those days, that's how you traveled, from Singapore in a January term, and was deposited in North Oxford in the cold of winter. Amongst people speaking English, they were supposed to be my kind of countrymen, but I felt like a spy outside their experience. None of them had really travelled beyond the Midlands, and the only other boy at the school was a fellow diplomat's son who'd come from Nepal. who became my best friend. And my housemaster was a bit tense about me coming from Singapore because he'd been a prisoner of the Japanese in Singapore the last time he was there. So I represented also for him not a particularly good experience. And so I remember with my best friend, diplomat son, going exploring. We kind of went bathing in the river. At midnight, we were trying, I suppose, to reach out of the world, the enclosed world we were in some crude way to get back to the world we'd come from and we knew. And there was this sandpit across the road, and I remember the sandpit as almost representing that kind of humid place that I remember. I mean, Singapore was unbelievably hot, and the Dragon in January was unbelievably cold, and the food was disgusting, etc., etc. But it became a very formative part of my life. It was the only life I knew. I made great friends there, and the reading, it was a bit kind of Alistair MacLean and Hammond Innes under the bedsheet, and Neville Shute had been at the Dragon. I mean, Betjeman had been at the Dragon. I mean, these were punishing English people. I didn't feel particularly, they weren't my temperature, but I mean, I loved John Buchan and etc. But it wasn't really until my father was posted to South America that, again, I don't know what he'd done wrong, but everywhere he was posted, we seemed to be in revolution. I mean, we were expelled from Cambodia. The embassy was burnt down, and we had to flee across the border. I mean, there's my early childhood memories of packing up and at the back of the Land Rover, like a kind of stage curtain, a canvas flap, and I'm seeing Phnom Penh receding. Then he was posted to Brazil during the time of the death squads, and that became rather fascinating to go from the Dragon to the holidays in Rio during this strange period of military dictatorship. And then Argentina during the military dictatorship. And almost the first writer I met who was the Argentine writer Borges, who was this blind magus, at the time, not particularly famous. I mean, he was hardly translated even into English. But he had the idea that anyone who spoke Shakespeare became Shakespeare. But he seemed that he was rather keen to put this into practice by meeting a man called Shakespeare. So my father arranged for me to go and kind of, I'm 15, I'm 16. Richard was at Winchester when I wrote my first piece of journalism, an interview with Borges. And I went to ask him if, he could give me a poem for my school magazine. And yes, he gave me a poem that had never been printed before, which I put in the school magazine. And I'd never read him. And I went to this kind of amazing dark flat, and he wanted me to meet his mother, who was about 102. Anyway, she was on the loo, and we kept waiting for her to come out. She never did. But and he wanted me to read to him, so I had to pluck from his shelves Kipling and Chesterton. I mean, quite unfashionable English writers, as we were being taught in England. And I remember he wanted me to read this particular Kipling poem, which was all about the kind of violent Vikings who were coming to rape and pillage, and he was like fulminating, and his favourite line in all poetry almost was "sicken again for the shouts and the slaughter." And I just remember him on the edge of his chair, inclining as I approached this line, and I would then, several times I would go and read to him. I remember reading. He wanted me to read some Shakespeare. And he wanted me to find the line in Hamlet, there's neither thinking, it's neither good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And he had said, I want to check that that's accurate. And so I found it, and the actual line is, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And he had left out the either, and he thought for me, he said, my version's better. Memory has made it better. And Anyway, I was at the time at school, and then when I left school, I spent a year on horseback in one of these estancias. I mean, I'd never ridden, but every day I was on this horseback, putting sorghum on my bottom to try and stop the sores. And I was with these amazing cowboys who'd never seen a mountain or the sea. And they all had daggers. And it was the time of the kind of periodic Falklands hysteria. And I remember I would ride my pony, or whatever it was, into the little village and tether it on the mud street, and I would have a beef with a fried egg on top on Friday nights, like kind of Bonanza, whatever the film was. And I remember a drunken gaucho coming up to me, hearing I was English, and bringing out his knife, which has got a facon, and he said, "Las Malvinas son nuestras, afuera," and he wanted to challenge me to this knife fight outside, and I said, "No habla español, no habla español," or whatever. Anyway, he was disarmed, but I remember telling Borges this, and he was incredibly, again, excited by the violence of his gaucho ancestors. And it was only then that I read him, I started to read him. And there was this amazing story he writes called The South, which was made into a film by Nick Rogue, Performance, where a man goes down to a Patagonian town for some reason, and he's in a bar, and he's about to go out, and then he's challenged to a knife fight. And he goes out not knowing how to wield a knife, to know that he's going out to meet his doom. And I was telling Borges what had happened to me, and he was kind of excited that it had been prefigured in his book. And then he came over to England later on, and I got him on a television program with Bruce Chatwin and Mario Vargas Llosa. It was a wonderful event just after the Falklands, which he had described as two bald men fighting over a comb. And I'll never forget. I mean, I brought him on to the stage, and Chatwin and Vargas Llosa had been just gabbling away the excitement of the Magi of South America about to come on. And Chatwin said, and as I'm standing with Borges beside the monitor, like this, and we're waiting to go on, and Chatwin was saying, "Borges, I mean, you can't go anywhere without taking a Borges. It's like packing a toothbrush." And Borges said, "How unhygienic." Anyway, so he became, despite the fact I never knew about him when I first met him, I read him, and he became very influential to me. He opened me into people like Fuentes and Octavio Paz and Vargas Llosa at a time when fiction seemed to be quite moribund in England. And in South America, no one believed in the press, and so the novelist became the truth speaker. If you wanted to find out what was going on in Peru or Brazil, you read the novels. And that's why the novelist had a very important role, much more important than when Salman Rushdie writes about Nicaragua, say, it didn't have the same effect as a novelist like Vargas Llosa writing about the Green House or The City of the Dogs, about the situation in the military dictatorship in Peru. Borges wasn't so political, but he still had a very powerful presence, and in fact, Perón had made him the inspector of chickens, I think, to kind of get him out of the library. But what I became really a South American bore when I came back to England, and then my father was posted to Peru during the time of the Shining Path, which was this very extreme terrorist organization, which kind of Al-Qaeda took quite a bit of lessons from, whereby it comes from the countryside, and it was led by a Kantian philosopher called Abimar Guzman, who didn't do interviews. He didn't leave any text in the same way that Jesus didn't leave text, or Plato. I mean, text takes its own reality. So he was far more powerful by just saying things and they were reported by other people. So we were living in Lima, and it was quite terrifying. I mean, these masked people would come into villages, they'd cut the throat of the priest, they'd write with his blood, Viva el Presidente, whatever, and then leave without saying what they wanted. And I became absolutely gripped by this phenomenon. And Chaplin had known about. He'd been in Peru and had seen some of these people. And it was a time when, again, in the West, no one was reporting this. And I remember going out with my sister and to try and get access to some of these villages where they were taking control. And I remember one night we went to Ayacucho, where it had all begun, where Guzman had been the professor of philosophy. And it was a night when suddenly people were going through the town, beating pan lids with torches, looking for what they called a pistaco. And a pistaco turned out to be an Andean myth of a white stranger who comes and takes your children and who then renders them into grease. And the spaceship Challenger had blown up because it lacked this human grease. And the last white person to come to Ayacucho had been an Argentine traveling salesman, and they stabbed him and then they plucked out his eyeballs, because that's how you have to kill a pistaco. And he was buried in the local cemetery. So Amanda and my sister and I went to the cemetery, and there was the recent grave. But anyway, we were the next whites in Ayacucho. And so they'd heard there were these two more whites, and they would come through. Anyway, we bolted ourselves up at night. We could hear all this crocodile line of people looking for this terrifying creature. And what had happened was that Sendero Luminoso had reactivated this Andean myth to turn the people against any outsiders. And I remember when I got back to Lima, I went to see the kind of godfather of Sendero, who'd been the rector at Ayacucho University, who was an ethnologist called Dr. Efraim Morote Best. And he agreed to see me. And I was very honest. I said, I'm working for the Times, my father's the ambassador, but I'd love to come and talk to you about, your movement. And so I went up very dramatically, kind of Neville Shooty. I kind of wrote my last address where I was going to be my father, if I'm not seen again. And I took a taxi up to Chaclacayo, where he was. And there he is with his niece, this kind of elderly ethnologist, telling me that revolution has to begin with blood, the tree has to be fallen down. And I said, well, what about journalists? Why don't you speak to them? He said, well, we kill journalists. Journalists take sides. And I said, well, why have you agreed to see me? And he said, my sister said you sounded very nice on the telephone. Anyway, I survived the talking to him. And what was, again, rather fascinating to me was that the only thing that I could discover about Guzman, the leader of the Shining Path, was that he didn't like put the music of Porgy and Bess, and he drank mineral water on his honeymoon. But other than that, he cut out every biographical detail from his narrative. I mean, if you went to Ayacucho to his department, he'd cut out photographs of himself. I mean, so he really had excised himself from the history in order to be this pure Andean Mao. I mean, he thought Fidel Castro was a chorus girl. I mean, he was the fourth sword of world revolution. And everybody else was not nearly as serious a communist as he was, or as violent. And so my first novel, I did a piece for Granta, a kind of factual piece, to try and get the material. And then I wrote a novel in which I invented him. I thought, if you're the fourth sword of world revolution, you've got to have some flaw. And why haven't you given interviews? So I gave him psoriasis, which was a Caucasian illness, not a kind of Andean illness. And I gave him a weakness for Camel Turkish cigarettes, which I had a weakness for, and the music of Frank Sinatra. So I pictured him in a hotel bedroom listening to kind of Frank Sinatra and smoking Turkish cigarettes while he was trying to be very, very kind of Maoist and Marxist. Anyway, I write the novel, and the other thing was I had him in the center of Lima, rather than it was thought he was abroad. It was a kind of headline, Abimal shopping in Harrods. No one knew where he was. Anyway, the novel comes out. It's my first novel. very nicely received in England, and I get on with my second novel, and then about 3 years later, he's captured. He's almost on the cusp of taking Lima. His men have come down, blackouts every night, they're bombing hotels. I was there myself when the hotel I was in was bombed about 2 days later, 23 people dead. I mean, the whole city was in terror. It looked like he was about to, like the Taliban with Kabul, quickly take Lima. And then suddenly he's captured above a ballet studio in central Lima by a rather amazing policeman who is also a philosopher. And I was in London when I heard, and Vargas Llosa was then living in London. And I had dinner with Vargas Llosa. I said, I want to hear all the details. And he said, I've just heard the most amazing details. He's captured above this ballet studio, and you're right, in your novel, En las Silvas, you talked about psoriasis and camel cigarettes. Well, the policeman who captured him kind of suspected something was going on in this ballet studio. She's a middle-class, very beautiful ballerina. And above her ballet studio was a kind of curtained flat, all the curtains always drawn. And for some reason, this policeman had decided to case the flat because the ballerina was linked to an English nun who had been distributing Sendero leaflets. And so he was looking through the rubbish, and she was bringing out much more rubbish than was normal for one girl living in a ballet studio. So you go through it, and in the rubbish he found Kennicort A, which is a cream for psoriasis, Camel cigarettes, whiskey bottles. Anyway. So, I mean, when Vargas says, "This is nice," but I have tingles. I've got to go out and find out what happened. I'm going to write a novel. I mean, you know, novels come to you, but I'm sure to you, it's like a gift. The sky's open for 2 seconds, and you're given the idea, and then they close, and you've had it. You've 3 years trying to remember what it was. And I go out to Lima. I see the policeman. I said, "Look, I've been after him as long as you have. Here's my first novel." and I gave him psoriasis and with Camel cigarettes. And the policeman, I love of Frank Sinatra. And the policeman said, "Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I went to we captured him and we put him on this island, and we were trying to be nice to him to get him to talk, and so we got him a birthday cake. And we said, 'Is there anything else you want?' He said, 'Yes, I'd love some Frank Sinatra in Spanish,' because apparently they used to sing My Way in Spanish. And I'm thinking, how on earth does a novelist get into the head of these people? I'm not making claims for myself, but I think if you absorb the available information, you probably do get quite close to what's going on. Anyway, so I said to the policeman, this is what the novel's going to be. You are going to be in love with the ballerina. So that as you're in love with the ballerina, you're dropping off your daughter in the ballet school, you're looking for Guzman outside, and more, as it's coming to the city, you're having to not tell the ballerina you're a policeman, and finally you realize that the ballerina who you're in love with is the protector of Guzman. That's my... and it wasn't true. I'm just taking your story. And he laughed. He said, "Yes, well, that's interesting, because I was in love with the ballerina. I was in love with the classical ballerina, and we were completely in love. And then I decided that I was a lawyer, and I felt I had to be a policeman to do some good. If somebody like me wasn't going to be a policeman, who was? So I became a policeman, and she was appalled. She begged me not to. She said, "If you're going to be a policeman, I can't marry you." So I said, "Okay, I've got to do this. It's my vocation." So 20 years pass, he captures public enemy number 1, and he gets a phone call from the ballerina saying, "You were right." So I liked all that. He liked the story. And I've seen him since. I went back and I gave him, he hadn't read the novel, I gave him a copy, and a copy of a film was made of it, which John Malkovich made a film of it with Javier Bardem as the policeman. So I went back with a copy of the film saying, "Javier Bardem is playing you, Costco." Well, you didn't know. Shall I go on to Chatwin? I mean,
yes.
Is this what you want?
Yes, definitely.
Not much of a debate.
No, it's not supposed to be a debate.
Chapman was the only person in England who'd heard of the Shining Path. How I met Chapman, it wasn't quite accurate that I met him in Patagonia, but I discovered him in Patagonia. I was going out to Argentina. I was working for the BBC, and I proposed an idea of a film on the British in Argentina, because Argentina had been the biggest population outside the Commonwealth of English passport holders. Something like 100,000 people lived in Argentina, growing fat on the railways and the cattle and the farming down south. Many Falkland Islands had come to Patagonia and opened up Patagonia. So I proposed this, and I went out, and it was just before the Falklands War, so the Falklands War hadn't happened. And there were no books on Patagonia. And the only book had just come out by an Englishman called In Patagonia, and I bought it. I didn't open it, and I went off to Argentina, where I had spent my teens. And I remember at a bus stop in Comodoro Rivadavia, waiting for the bus, opening In Patagonia, and I'm sure all of you will have had this experience with a favourite book of yours when you think it's speaking only to you. I mean, I remember having it with Love in the Time of Cholera. I said, he's written this for me, only for me. I understand this book like that. And anyway, I had it with reading In Patagonia. I just thought it was the most extraordinary book. I mean, it wasn't really about Patagonia at all, but it was. It was kind of zigzagging through time and stories, and it wasn't a geographic place. But yet he was there, seeing all these Welsh farmers or Scottish exiles or Butch Cassidy's traces. Anyway, I got back from Patagonia, and I had to see the author. I felt impelled to see the author of this amazing book. So I found he was living in central London in a flat in Eaton Place, and I went to see him. And in the book, he doesn't say a thing. He's a silent observer. When I met him, he never stopped talking. I mean, his stories just come out of him. A fever of storytelling, all of which were linked or attempting to be linked. And the Germans have a word for this fever of storytelling, which he embodied, and I felt probably I have a bit of too. And just to give an example of his effect on anybody, he was brilliant at bringing you into his own story and making you part of it and making you contribute to his story. And I'll give you this example. When I was in Argentina, just after my horseback experience, I had gone up with my father to the north, and we discovered the existence of these statues all to a man, a freedom fighter called Güemes, who was a famous gaucho cowboy who had fought the Spanish. So he'd been the local kind of head of the local resistance movement against the Spanish oppressors. And he'd had a gaucho army, and he would wear a poncho, which we all wore as gauchos, which was black and red. And I'm sure you've seen kind of wonderful red gaucho with black fringes. And it's red for the death of Güemes and black for the blood of his soldiers, or the other way around. So I knew all about Güemes, but what the mayor told us, that Güemes was a Hispanicization of Weems, and that after Waterloo, one of the kind of second sons of the Weems family, a famous Scottish family, Charterist, William Waldegrave is from the family, Provost of Eton. I mean, they own a wonderful house, Stanway, on the way to the Malvern Hills. Their tartan is black and red. And so Güemes was Weems, and his colours are not those of his salt blood or his soldiers, they're those of his tartan. And I was telling this to Chapman, and he kind of got in a Borgesian excitement, frenzy. He was at that moment working on a theory about the colour red. And he had discovered that these red ponchos that I had worn, that were based on the Scottish tartan, as I had possibly discovered, had been used by the kind of really tough kind of militia, the Colorados, under the dictator Rosas, who had ended up as a milk farmer in Southampton in exile. But he'd been a really vicious kind of commander unit with these red ponchos. Anyway, during the kind of freedom fighting, Garibaldi, the Italian future freedom fighter, was fighting in Uruguay. And he takes a consignment of these ponchos from a warehouse in Montevideo back to Italy, where he's going to try and reunify Italy. On the ship, this is all Chapman telling me this, on the ship he scissors out these ponchos into the uniforms, which will become the uniforms for what are known as his red shirts. And then this becomes the Italian uniform for the unification of Italy. It then becomes the red flag flying over the barricades in Dresden in 1848, and it is the red flag flying above the Kremlin. So within 5 minutes of meeting Bruce Chatwin, we had established an absolutely persuasive link between a Scots kilt and the red flag of socialism. Now, that's just one story of what Chatwin did with everything. I mean, he was so exciting, and if you read his books, they're full of the song lines or whatever. They're full of these connective tissue that we're all linked. You know, West Africa will be linked to South America. There's a kind of Kon-Tiki idea. Very exciting to meet him. And after he died, I was asked by his widow to write his biography. And so I spent 7 years, which was the length of time that you used to transport criminals to Australia. And when I finished, I'd travelled all through the world twice in his footsteps. I was just so sick of Chatwin, I wanted to go to a Chatwin-free zone, somewhere he'd never been, just to recover my sexuality, my heterosexuality, just to have a clean air of something that hadn't been written about by Chatwin. And the only two places he'd never been were Baffin Island, which I didn't want to go to, and Tasmania. And I knew nothing about Tasmania. I'd met Matthew Neal at a literary festival in Australia, who'd just written this marvellous novel, English Passengers, which won all sorts of prizes, quite rightly. And he had described it to me in terms that were rather beguiling, kind of Georgian buildings on the waterfront, wonderful undiscovered green glacial valleys, a very beautiful, slightly strange 19th century atmosphere. Anyway, I go out there and I stay with Tom Keneally in Sydney, who had been my girlfriend's professor. I'm taking my girlfriend. We land in Tasmania, we do a trek, and I'm like, it's like I've come home. All my life I've travelled to these places and I've never felt quite at home. I feel at home. I feel this is the most amazing landscape. And I found a house for sale, which is the same amount of money as the Times is about to serialise the Chatwin biography. I mean, it's £60,000, a lot of money for serialisation, but it was a house, 5 acres on a beach facing the South Pole. I buy it. The other end, I mean, Tasmania is so far away. I mean, it's 26 hours by flight and then another. And there's a wonderful guidebook. I was in one of the little hotels, and the guidebook, I opened it, it said, Tasmania is so far away, literally that it's the end of the world, that if you travel any further, you're on your way home again. And that's what I felt with this house. It was a 2-bedroom house. I could imagine writing. And so I tell my mother, I said, Mummy, I got something wonderful to tell you. She said, I'm so glad. She's thinking I'm about to marry my girlfriend, who she very much liked. I said, I'm going to buy a house in Tasmania. She sent my father out to dissuade me. And 3 days later, he's on the beach. He turns around. He's got tears in his eyes. I've never been anywhere more beautiful, he said. And he's been out every year since. But the point of the story is that he goes back to England to tell my mother that it's okay, it's really nice. And he then discovers in my grandmother's basement this sack of letters from a relative of a black sheep in the family on my grandmother's side. These are letters from 1790, and they're from Van Diemen's Land. And isn't that what Tasmania was called? I said, yes. So he said, well, I mean, it looks like we've got an ancestor from Tasmania. And I'm not that interested. I'm sick of old letters. I've been in the Bodleian for 6 years looking at Chatwin stuff. I'm sick of it. But one day, I take the letters back to Tasmania. One day, I start to look at them, and they're absolutely fantastic. I mean, he's having a very big argument with his father. He's in Liège during the Revolution. He's then he's meeting George Washington in America, and then he's writing from Van Diemen's Land. And so I go to the library, to the Tasmania Library one day in Hobart, and I say to the librarian, have you heard of this man, Anthony Fen Kem? And she said, yes, yes. And I said, go well. He's known as the father of Tasmania. She said, what? He said, no, he comes here, he takes Tasmania on behalf of, seizes it from the French, kind of settlers up north, and he plants the flag in, and it becomes, he seizes it. There's a town named after him, Kempton. And he's Aldous Huxley's grandfather, or great-grandfather. And I said, well, he's also a relation of mine. She said, I wouldn't go around saying that. She said, he's a man of whom I've heard not one word of good. So this, again, was a red rag to me. I said, well, fantastic, black sheep in the family. So I did a book discovering, before I did that, I rang my mother. My mother said one day, I've just discovered, darling, that we've got, on my side of the family, we've got relatives in Tasmania. I said, what? She said, yes, it turns out my father, who had been in Oxford and at the Dragon and taught, who was almost my first image of a writer, I'll come on to him in a second, but his uncle put him through Oxford and then got bankrupt and went out to Tasmania. And all I got is the name. And so, slightly heart-sinking, I said, well, what is it? And she tells me, and I look in the telephone book, and there's one name with it. I ring the telephone. An old lady answers, and I kind of say, I think we might be related. She says, oh, yes, I got your picture on my wall and your mother's picture. And she's a kind of genealogist, and she told me the most amazing story. She and her sister, both virgins in their 80s, had kept the family farm, a 40-acre farm in the north. They didn't have money, they would barter, and they were the descendants of this man who put my grandfather through Oxford. And I just thought, this is astonishing. I go to Tasmania, get as far away from Bruce Chapman in England as I can, and then I kind of discover my own roots. And so I wrote this book called In Tasmania. Just to wrap up with Chatwin, I went to see this old lady, Madge, and she lived about 4 miles from a village called Kindred. And so I said, Madge, why is it called Kindred? She said, well, because everybody's related, apparently. So I thought, I better go have a look at it. So I go to Kindred, which is about 6 houses, but a cemetery. There's a Victorian cemetery, and lots of marble tombs with kind of rusting crosses. So I go into the cemetery, and there, a veined marble grey tomb, Elizabeth Chatwin, dies 1862, I think. Next door, another Chatwin. And now I look in the telephone book, and there are lots of Chatwins from the village of Kindred. So I ring up and say, oh, you better speak to Max Chatwin. He's the kind of senior Chatwin. And he said, well, you better speak to my wife. She's just written a book, 6 Chatwins, 6 generations in Tasmania. There are 124 Chatwins around that village, more Chatwins than exist anywhere in the world. So I'd gone to Tasmania to escape Bruce Chatwin, only to discover, as I repeat, my story, but Chatwin, his great uncle, jumped ship in the Melbourne Gold Rush and ended up in Tasmania. So the moral of the story is you can't escape anywhere. So then I wrote in Tasmania, and I came back to Oxford when my children were at the local school there with the Aborigines, and they would come back to England to our kind of primary school where we were living in the countryside in Wiltshire. And then suddenly we had to make a decision: do they stay in Tasmania, or do they? And I made a decision to send them back to Oxford, to repeat in a kind of hideous middle-class way the journey I had taken. And so I came back to Oxford. And Oxford had changed beyond all recognition. My grandfather, this man who, with the Tasmanian connection, he'd been he was... Borges was my first positive experience of a writer. My grandfather was quite a negative experience. He was a man called S.P.B. Mace, who wrote 350 books, and who died in poverty aged about 90 when his wife, my grandmother, ran off with another man who proposed to her when she was 17. And he died kind of heartbroken. And I thought, if that's what a writer is, count me out. And he'd been very famous in his day. He'd been a broadcaster in the 20s and 30s in the war, started the Kitchen Front series during the war, and had been at Christchurch. And he wrote he wrote sometimes 6 books a year. And he obviously was bipolar, because he was writing his books to keep his family. And they were books with titles like I Return to Scotland, or I Go Back to Switzerland, or Some Books I Like, and then I found a sequel, More Books I Like. And these titles that kind of were. But I grew up with him as quite a famous person. I mean, John Betjeman was a great friend of his and gave the speech at I know he's not a name to conjure with at Keble, but he gave the speech at my parents' wedding in Oxford, and people like Brown, who's the philosopher, the famous philosopher? Brown McGee kind of worshipped him. He was really very famous on the radio when we didn't have television. He was the early voice of radio. So I grew up with him knowing he was famous, but I couldn't read the books. They seemed to be terrible. And so I thought, I'm not going to be a writer. That's what what's what happened to writers? They die in poverty and their wife goes off. But he had been at the Dragon, he taught at the Dragon, he adored the Dragon, and I was at the Dragon, and my mother was at the Dragon, and I had adored the Dragon in a way. Anyway, I bring my children back. I'm not sure if they adore the Dragon, but by the time I come back, the place has changed. It's now a place where the rich launder their children, the rich from all over the world. And the kind of middle class professionals, which I would have fallen into the category, were very, very few left. And it was rather a gripping social experiment for me to see these people on the touchline. And, the only people who were free to go on a rainy afternoon at Bromsgrove to watch your son kick a rugby ball in the third 11 was either a novelist who was trying to struggle, or a hedge fund manager, or somebody, one of these parents, they were colossally wealthy. I mean, they had security guards, they flew in. And what I discovered is that they found it absolutely intolerable for you not to know who they were. And so I'm on the touchline, and they didn't want to know about my novels or ask me about myself. I mean, they want to talk about themselves. And I just had story after story on the touchline of people who were, doing the most amazing things. Like one example, do you remember Dominique Strauss-Kahn was arrested at the airport who was about to be a shoo-in for president of France? So there's a very nice fellow father who's French, who'd been at Winchester. He worked for Goldman's, a very nice man. We're watching Barney and Sebastian kick the balls, and it's raining, and it's just, so Strauss-Kahn's just been arrested. So I say, come on, John, what do you think happened in New York? He said, well, I know what's happened. I've just been rung up by the manager. We own the hotel. I said, so what happened? And he said, well, he was a man very keen on quite violent sex, and he'd turned up he'd asked for his normal girl to come, and all this is on security cameras and everything that the hotel had, and apparently she wasn't available, so he's told, Dominique, don't worry, there's a wonderful, wonderful girl who knows very au fait with your tastes, and she'll be along very soon. She's gorgeous, can't recommend her enough. So he waits, ding dong, enter, I think, Sudanese room cleaner, who he takes to be the Nancy replacement, and starts to do what he normally does, which is not very attractive to the Sudanese room cleaner, who starts screaming, and this kind of exacerbates the situation. And suddenly, as he's getting more and more into his normal performance, ding dong, and he opens the door, and it's the Nancy replacement. And he realizes what's happened, and he runs for the airport. And as soon as you hear this, that's exactly what must have happened. I mean, anyway, I'm hearing this on the touchline. And I just began to have all these conversations, Iraq, Iran, Cuba. I knew what was going on in Libya with Gaddafi, days before John Simpson did. And I thought, God, what a wonderful arena, a stage set to write a thriller. And so I wrote a story, my last novel, The Sandpit, is all about nuclear fusion, the sandpit at the Dragon where the secret is hid, not to give the plot away. Essentially, it's a kind of Iranian scientist who a young Iranian scientist comes to Oxford, Clarendon, and he cracks nuclear fusion. And suddenly, what's he do with this knowledge? And he hands it to his friend, who's also a father at the Dragon. He hides it in the sandpit. The English narrator, like in Treasure Island, kind of blind Pew's black mark, he takes this terrible secret knowledge, and what's he do with it? So you'll have to read the novel to find out what he does with it. Except you may not have to read the novel, because should we come on about Ian Kellis and Roger Kellis?
Yeah, no, let's, because that's an extraordinary story.
So it was a thriller motif, this novel. When I became a writer, the man who gave me a push was John le Carré, who had been a friend of my parents at Oxford, but I was about 30, I'd had my first novel published, and I went to interview him for the Telegraph, and he had read it, and it was a time when I really wanted to leave journalism and see if I could write full time, and he gave me the very generous push, saying, I think you could do it, and I will lend you a cottage next to our house in Cornwall. Whenever you want to write, you can use that. And the most fantastically generous gesture, just at a moment when I needed the courage to leave a very good job and salary for nothing, for the unknown. And so I read 4 novels and books down in his house in Cornwall. So part of the Sandpit is a kind of le Carré homage, but I didn't want to do, I'm not a thriller writer, so I wanted to find a solution that wasn't a thriller solution to what you do with the secret. And somebody who was at school with myself and with Robin, I go back to this man I talked at the beginning, the young boy who'd also been abroad, who'd been in Nepal, whose father was ambassador, who became my best friend at the Dragon. I'd lost touch with him. He had an elder brother who'd been head boy and had gone to rugby and come to Oxford, scholar at New College. My friend had a scholar at rugby, scholar at Univ, and I'd lost touch. But then I'd heard that he and his brother had joined a cult. After leaving Oxford, they both joined this kind of meditation cult. And it had been disbanded a few years later, and my friend had continued on as a doctor in the NHS, but his elder brother had kind of continued. I have here in mind a Chatwin-type mendicant. He continued traveling the world, reading books, sleeping rough in Port Meadow, but he had a university Bodleian card, so he would read in the Bodleian, and he had a union card. He would sleep in the afternoons in the union, because he was allowed in until it closed, and then he would sleep rough. He wasn't mad, he wasn't on drugs, he was on a different path. And so when I heard about this, I was very keen to meet up with him again, because I'd last seen him when we were 12 or 13. So he was coming out back into the world, and so he was on the internet. I was able to kind of communicate. And we met at the Dragon School. And this is a rather amazing day. It's the day of my publication for this history book, 6 Minutes in May, which All Souls very kindly let me use the old library, one of the oldest buildings in Oxford, up at the top of a staircase, to kind of have a small reception there. And so I've invited this man to meet at the Dragon and then he will come to the reception. This is his first outing in public, really. And at the reception, there will be some of his best friends from 50 years ago, from the Dragon. So we meet at the Dragon. The last time I saw him, he was head boy there. And we go round, and he tells me where he slept for 18 months before. He climbed over the fence and slept on the bank. And then we have lunch at the St. Giles Cafe, which used to be my greasy spoon, with his brother. We used to go there and illegally have fried egg on toast and hide in case the masters were going by. And we have lunch there, and then he tells me the story of his life, which was extraordinary, that he reads everything that he's interested in. So he goes to the Vera Harmsworth Library and he reads up this, he reads these different subjects, and he's done it for 30 years. There was something holy about his aspirations. I mean, he hadn't yet got an answer, but he would sleep rough. He would sleep under down in Iffley at the church. And I know the vicar's a Wycomist, who was at Winchester with me. And I told him, do you realise that somebody's sleeping in your porch? He didn't know. He would get up at 4, he would sleep in the porch, and he'd get up at 4, do his teeth, backpack on, along the towpath to the McDonald's at the station, which would open. He went through the day with me, what he was spending. If he needed money, he would sometimes sit in St Giles. I'm sure you all passed him. And you would give him enough money to live on. Sometimes you get 30 quid a day, 40 quid a day. And then if it was raining, he would try and go into one of the shelters, but that cost £22.50 a night. But otherwise, he wasn't at all, he'd only once or twice had violence. He wasn't asking for money in terms of, he was absolutely on a kind of Chatwinian road. And I just thought, it was kind of unbelievably moving to me. I mean, I felt he had done something I wish I'd had the courage to do. I'm not sure he's yet found the answer. But it was for the novel also, it was a rather amazing way of finding the solution, what you would do with the nuclear fusion secret.
So it came round full circle.
Yeah.
We spoke at length earlier about this idea that a novelist, when he comes to write history, perhaps comes at it from a completely unambiguous route, because he's interested, he doesn't come in, he's not perceived to be a left-wing critic, a right-wing critic, a centrist. A novelist approaches history in a very different way to a historian, and perhaps gets at truths that elude historians. And you've written some remarkable works that are not novels. Could you give us your thoughts on that, and a little teaser for everybody for your upcoming book on Ian Fleming? Because, as we said earlier, you can go to any far-flung corner of the world you go to where English is spoken. The two names that people are going to recognise are William Shakespeare and James Bond. And for many people, they think James Bond's real. So a little teaser, Nicholas, a little teaser.
Well, I'm sure Barney will agree that a novel where the novelist is trying to use the characters for political propaganda doesn't work. And that why Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, you don't know the politics of the characters, or his politics, you don't know his politics. He doesn't judge the characters. He inhabits them so totally that they survive. And so I use a rowing analogy with Robin. Rowing's the most boring sport in the world to watch. So you have to start talking with another fellow father. But I had a kind of epiphany when I realized that these rowers I was watching they're colossally egomaniacs, like writers. But in order for the boat to work and go fast, they had to suppress their ego. They had to spread their ego into the boat, into the team. If one of them was trying to show off or be faster or stronger, the whole boat was ruined. And it struck me that in a sense, I mean, it's a kind of slightly clumsy parallel, but in a sense, a writer has to suppress their ego totally into their characters. And if there's any show of the writer's ego above water, it's a disaster. I mean, that's not to say the writer isn't an egotistical monster, but the novel will work when you've suppressed yourself into the character. And with history, I think quite often, well, I'm not a historian, I slightly wish I'd studied history, but for instance, this key moment in English history where it should be Halifax who's going to become Prime Minister. He's wanted by everybody. He's wanted by the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, Chamberlain, the press. He wants it, in a sense. I mean, you are not a politician without wanting to be number one. And all we've got is him meeting Churchill and Chamberlain and David Margesson, the chief whip, in Downing Street at a particular moment on a particular afternoon. We don't know what went on in that room. I mean, no one wrote it down. Everybody writes it down later. Churchill, 5 years later. Halifax, that day, he says it to his private secretary, who writes it down. He says it to another private secretary the following year, who writes it down in a different way. Margesson never writes it down. Chamberlain never writes it down. So we don't know what took place between these people, and all the accounts that took place are all different and contradictory. And so you're left with almost, I mean, I don't want to make claims for the novelist, but you're left with the novelist's approach of speculation, informed speculation, to try and understand what goes on in this moment that is so crucial for our, otherwise we would all be speaking German perhaps. But I think it's incredibly exciting for the novelist to bring the arsenal of the novel, because it's all about storytelling. It's all about being as truthful as you can be. I mean, and what slightly shocked me as a novelist, discovering historians, is when I went to do all the footnotes for 6 minutes in May, and I had to kind of check, the quotations that I'd taken that I'd often borrowed from historians. I went back to the original sources in the Bodleian, or the original manuscripts. I'd say 25% of the quotes that I had quoted were wrongly quoted. They had taken from the manuscripts, they'd either spelt, or they'd missed words, they got the wrong word, they'd elliptically left out central stuff like kind of theatre reviews that take kind of 4 words and say masterpiece, whereas it probably said something else. Punctuation, but I mean, I was astonished at the lack of, expecting that novelists are kind of loose and fast with the truth. I was astonished to see how much slacker historians were when they came to use their evidence. I'm told that's not a rare discovery. No, I think history should absorb all the kind of the novelist's arsenal, and similarly, I think novelists should absorb the historian's disciplines. I'm slightly going off tangent. Do you want to talk about Fleming?
Yeah,
okay, I'll talk about
Soupçon Fleming.
Okay, Soupçon Fleming. So, Ian Fleming. I wasn't very interested in Ian Fleming. I was rather more interested in his brother Peter Fleming, who, for 6 minutes in May, is the first English officer to land in the continent in the Second World War, in the Norway campaign, and was a kind of, I mean, many people think he might have been a model for James Bond, but he was an absolute hero in the 30s. In fact, Halifax thought he would be Viceroy of India, people thought he'd be the editor of the Times. He wrote these astonishing travel books, kind of pre-Chatwin, Brazilian Adventure, News from Tartary. He was the most famous Italian there's ever been. He's the elder brother, and the younger brother's the kind of black sheep who sleeps with women, who drinks too much, who doesn't write. And it's a bit like Evelyn Waugh, Alec Waugh, where Alec Waugh, age 17, writes this amazing book, The Loom of Youth, which is a scandalous success. And Evelyn Waugh can't then go to Sherborne. And Alec Waugh becomes this very, very famous writer in the 20s, just as Peter Fleming was very, very famous in the 30s. And then suddenly something turns. And with Alec Waugh, you have this extraordinary experience in the 50s where he can't get published. And who is the most famous writer of the English language? It's Evelyn Waugh, who's just produced Brideshead Revisited, the great Oxford novel, before the Sandpin. And forgive me for being this disease of connectivity. My grandfather had taught Alec Waugh at Sherborne, and had got The Loom of Youth published with his publisher. And he is, in The Loom of Youth, the very good teacher. And he kept up with Alec Waugh, and when he was at Sherborne, he told Alec Waugh of his story of a kind of great-great-grandfather who'd gone to Jamaica and the sugar trade from Liverpool, and apparently had had a family of, a black family from some of his plantation workers. And my grandfather was very keen to one day go out to Jamaica to meet his black relatives. And he had told Alec Waugh this when Alec Waugh was a 17-year-old. The Loom of Youth is published, Alec Waugh becomes famous, then he becomes less famous, he becomes less famous. By 1954, he can't get published, and he's going to take barbiturates, he's going to kill himself. This was all confirmed by his son Peter. But what happens? He bumps into my grandfather again, his early mentor, who has just come from the Cumberland Hotel full of excitement because he has finally got hold of one of his relatives from Jamaica, the poet Roger Mace, who's a very great poet, novelist, who's coming to England for the first time. And so my grandfather's asked him to meet him for lunch at the Cumberland Hotel. He's coming. But my grandfather's under the impression that Roger Mace is one of his white relatives in Jamaica. And so when Roger Mace comes into the room, my grandfather doesn't know it's him. And Roger Mace is a black Jamaican. And they finally meet and they have a great lunch. And my grandfather's thrilled to finally meet his Jamaican family. And he tells Alec Waugh. Alec Waugh then writes a novel that's given the biggest advance in the history of Hollywood. It's made into a film called Island in the Sun with Harry Belafonte and Joan Fontaine. It completely revivifies his career. But pertinent to the Ian Fleming story, there's a 17-year-old boy in Jamaica called Chris Blackwell, whose mother's having an affair with Ian Fleming, who's Ian Fleming's last love affair. Chris Blackwell loves the music and decides to set up a music company for reggae music called Island Records, based on Island in the Sun. It becomes very famous. Chris Blackwell works as a kind of gopher on the first film, Dr. No. He's there when Ursula Andress comes out of the water. Chris Blackwell now owns GoldenEye, which is where Fleming wrote every single James Bond book. And what I particularly like about this story is that my grandfather, when he told Alec Waugh to write, he gave him a kind of regime for writing. What I didn't discover until I started researching into Fleming is that when Fleming started writing, he took his regime from Alec Waugh. So in a sense, he's taking my grandfather's regime into writing the James Bond books. So Fleming, he's more famous than Shakespeare probably. What tilted me to accepting, the family approached me to write this authorized biography. It's in fact the second authorized book. The first one was written by his person who worked for him at the Sunday Times, called John Pearson, who's only died this weekend, a wonderful journalist. And it's a wonderful book. But there's quite a lot of what he wasn't able to discover that's come out since. And Anne Fleming also kind of censored quite a bit of the material that she wouldn't let him use. What tilted me to accepting the commission was I didn't really want to be 4 or 5 years in the head of somebody I thought was an unpleasant, Eldertonian, masochistic kind of wife-beater, which is slightly how I had perceived Fleming out of the corner of my eye. But I did too much kind of due diligence on him, and I went to see the few people left who remember him, and I went to read some of the books about him. And what was really puzzling is that how often the word kindness came up in connection to him. So some of his best friends were very upright golfers, bridge players that he'd known all his life. They weren't particularly interesting people, but they were incredibly honest, a bit like his grandfather who'd started Fleming's Bank. men of complete probity. And I thought that's interesting. It's not quite what the image I had. But more important, the women with whom he'd had long, I mean, he was obviously irresistible to women. And everybody went to bed with him and then regretted the fact he didn't want to go to bed with them. But he was never had up for kind of pouncing on anybody, inappropriate behavior. They all wanted more of it. I mean, this is a generalization, but what each of these women would say was how kind he was. And I'm thinking, well, this isn't the Ian Fleming I'm getting. And I thought that's quite an interesting mystery to see where does this mismatch come from that we've got of Fleming. And actually, James Bond has submerged him. It's unlike Le Carré, where we think of Le Carré before we think of George Smiley. I think we think of James Bond before we think of Ian Fleming. And that's slightly unfair. I think he was a very remarkable, in the war, I've just been writing about the war years. You know, he really was a very, very important figure. Not even Richard Dearlove, when I spoke to him the other day, knew that, you know, Ian Fleming was chairing GIC meetings. He had set up this commando unit to go and grab Enigma machines, which helped to shorten the war. He was setting up what became the CIA in America. He was one of the very few people who could liaise between MI5, MI6, SOE, the Ministry of Economic Warfare, Bletchley Park. He was one of only 30 people indoctrinated to Ultra, and one of the others was his brother. So you've got two people absolutely at the centre of the inner sanctum, in a way that Graham Greene and Le Carré, both of whom I admire immensely, weren't. I mean, they were completely on the outer rim of intelligence. And perhaps I should finish, because with just before, last year I gave Le Carré gave his last outing at the German embassy. It was an amazing occasion. It was about 2 days before lockdown. And it was completely packed with his quite understandably, you know, important admirers. I mean, there were cabinet, ex-cabinet secretaries, there were MPs, there were representatives of the press, and it was packed. And he talked just kind of brilliant for an hour and a half. And he talked a bit about Fleming, because he had kind of created Smiley in defiance of Bond. So Smiley is everything Bond isn't. And, I mean, Le Carré is it's pointless kind of competing with them on their literary skills. I mean, this isn't about that. It's about the phenomenon of James Bond, who is a kind of cultural icon, much probably more influential than a Le Carré cultural icon. Anyway, it's just before when we were in touch up until he died rather suddenly, and about 2 days before he died, I suddenly had a kind of brainwave. Because Le Carré keeps talking about every time he gives every year, there's a rare interview with John Le Carré. I think if you count the rare interviews, there are probably thousands of them. But he managed to create a mystery amongst the press that, you know, it was always rare what he said. It wasn't rare at all. Anyway, in one of his rare interviews, or in many of his rare interviews, perhaps in every rare interview, he talked about where he got the name Le Carré from, because his real name is David Cornwall. And I think there are various versions that he sees it off the top of a London bus, and he sees the name of a shop or something. Anyway, it changes the whole time. So I'm researching into Fleming, and Fleming's first James Bond book has this villain, and it's 10 years before Le Carré's spy came in from the cold, under the name Le Carré, and the villain is Le Chiffre, which means a cipher or number. And there's the famous casino scene in Casino Royale with Le Chiffre. And there's a story by Fleming about Monte Carlo, in which Fleming describes the croupier's call in Monte Carlo. He says, faithfully, Le Carré. It's a call. Le Carré is a call in gambling. So I'm thinking, is it possible that, you know, somewhere in your subconscious, you got this Le Chiffre, Le Carré, the gambling thing from a Fleming? Anyway, I emailed him, very excited. He doesn't reply because he's died. But I probably will bring it into my book.
Connections.
Connections.
Bruce,
Connections.
This has been an extraordinary evening and a huge pleasure. And you're going to have to come back again to give us the second half. And we're all huge.
Well, if you'd like, I'll come and give it. If you want to talk on Fleming when I finish the biography,
could you?
Absolutely.
We'd love that. So
I mean,
that's a date.
the material is fantastic.
And can I ask you all to show your appreciation of Nicholas's work and extraordinary generosity of his time this evening in the traditional way?